The Montana sun pressed down on the afternoon like a hand against heated iron, and Grace Winters learned its weight the moment William Garrett tore her photograph in half. She stood on the platform of Copper Ridge Station with her single carpet bag at her feet, watching pieces of her own face flutter to the weathered planks below. The train behind her released a long breath of steam, impatient to continue its westward journey. But Grace couldn't move. Her legs had forgotten how. Garrett didn't speak. He simply looked at the photograph in his hands, then at Grace, then back to the photograph. His eyes moved from her face to her body with the cold assessment of a man evaluating livestock, finding each part wanting. The disappointment in his expression was complete and devastating. Without a word, he tore the photograph down the middle, dropped both halves at her feet, and turned away. The crowd that had gathered to watch the train's arrival fell into a silence so profound that Grace could hear the paper settling against the wood. Every face turned toward her. Every eye witnessed her humiliation. The platform became a stage, and she the unwilling performer in a tragedy she hadn't written. She had imagined this moment 1,000 times during the 3 weeks of travel from Philadelphia. In her imaginings there had been awkwardness, perhaps disappointment, maybe even a difficult conversation. But she had never imagined silence. She had never imagined being dismissed without words, reduced to something not worth the effort of speech. The air shimmered with heat as Garrett's figure receded down the main street of Copper Ridge. Grace watched him go, her mind struggling to process what had just happened. Behind her, the train whistle shrieked, and the great iron beast began to pull away from the platform. The sound jolted her into a terrible realization. That train was her last connection to anything familiar. It was leaving, and she had no ticket to follow. A woman's voice cut through the silence, sharp and satisfied. Eleanor Patterson stood near the station house, fanning herself with deliberate slowness. Her eyes held the bright interest of someone who thrived on other people's misfortune. "Well," Eleanor said to no one in particular, "and everyone at once, I suppose that settles that? Mail order arrangements are always such gambles. Sometimes the photograph doesn't quite match the reality." The words landed like stones. Grace felt heat crawl up her neck that had nothing to do with the relentless sun. She wanted to speak, to defend herself, to explain that the photograph had been taken only 4 months ago and was perfectly accurate. She wanted to tell them all that she was exactly who she'd claimed to be in her letters. But her throat had closed around the words, trapping them somewhere between her heart and her mouth. Henry Morrison stepped forward, a man in his 60s with a shopkeeper's apron and genuine sympathy in his weathered face. "Miss, is there someone we can wire family back east who could send train fare?" The kindness in his voice nearly broke her completely. Grace shook her head, not trusting herself to speak. There was no one. Her parents had died of typhoid fever 2 years ago within days of each other. The memory of those twin losses still had the power to hollow her out. Her Aunt Martha had taken her in afterward, but made it clear with every passing day that Grace's presence was a burden. Another mouth to feed in a household already stretched thin. The advertisement for mail-order brides had seemed like providence when Grace found it a chance to build something new, to be wanted, to matter to someone. "I have a little money," Grace managed, finally, her voice sounding strange and distant to her own ears. "Perhaps there's a boarding house." Eleanor's fan snapped closed with a decisive click. "The boarding house is full," she announced. "Miners came through last week and took every bed. And anyway, a young woman alone." She let the implication hang in the air, heavy with judgment. The platform began to empty. The spectacle had passed, and people were returning to their ordinary Friday afternoon routines. Grace watched them go with a detached sort of panic, as if she were observing her own disaster from a great distance. The sun continued its assault, turning the air thick and difficult to breathe. Her carpet bag suddenly felt impossibly heavy, though it contained everything she owned. 2 dresses, a nightgown, undergarments, her mother's Bible, a silver locket, and the bundle of letters from William Garrett that had painted a picture of a life she would now never live. She bent slowly and picked up the torn pieces of her photograph, smoothing them against her skirt with fingers that had started to shake. In the picture, she looked hopeful, young and hopeful, and stupidly naive. The girl in that photograph had believed that starting over was possible, that a man's letters could be trusted, that showing up and working hard would be enough. "You should take the evening train back," Henry said gently. "It comes through at 6. I'm sure we could arrange something." Before Eleanor could interject with another cutting remark, movement at the far end of the platform caught Grace's attention. A man was walking toward them with the easy stride of someone accustomed to covering long distances. A child skipped beside him, her small hand clasped in his large one. Even from this distance, Grace could see the man's weathered face beneath a worn hat pulled low against the sun. They reached the platform just as the last of the curious onlookers dispersed. The man paused, taking in the scene with eyes that missed nothing. Grace with her carpet bag and her torn photograph. Henry's uncomfortable posture, the empty platform, and the lingering atmosphere of witnessed humiliation. Afternoon, Henry, the man said, his voice carrying the roughness of someone who spent more time with horses than people. Train on time today, Benjamin Cole. Henry replied, relief palpable in his voice. Yes, just dropped off passengers. The child peered around her father's legs, studying Grace with the frank curiosity of the young. She had dark hair in two neat braids, and eyes the same gray as her father's, though hers held warmth where his held caution. The girl couldn't have been more than 7 years old, and something in her careful observations suggested she'd already learned to read situations beyond her years. The man they'd called Benjamin looked directly at Grace. His gaze was steady and assessing, but without the cold judgment Garrett had shown. He was simply taking in information, measuring a situation the way a rancher might measure weather patterns or the health of livestock. Miss, he said with a slight nod. Then his attention shifted to Henry. What's the situation here? Henry explained in low tones, though Grace could hear every word. The mail order arrangement, the rejection, the lack of funds or prospects. As he spoke, Benjamin's expression didn't change, but something shifted in the set of his shoulders. An attention that might have been anger or might have been something else entirely. William Garrett did this, Benjamin asked when Henry finished. Left her stranded with no means and no place to go. He has every right to refuse the arrangement. Henry began, clearly uncomfortable with the conversation's direction. I didn't ask about his rights. Benjamin interrupted, his voice going quiet in a way that suggested more threat than shouting ever could. I asked if he abandoned a woman without resources or shelter. The child tugged on her father's hand. Papa, she whispered, not quite quietly enough. Is that lady going to cry, Lily? Benjamin said the name, gentle but firm. A father's redirection. Grace realized her eyes had indeed filled with tears, though she'd been fighting them back since the moment Garrett walked away. She blinked rapidly, turning away under the pretense of adjusting her bag. The platform planks beneath her feet felt unsteady, or perhaps that was just her legs finally giving way to the shock that had been building since she'd stepped off the train. Benjamin Cole studied her for a long moment, his gray eyes thoughtful. Then he spoke directly to Grace, his tone matter-of-fact and businesslike. You have skills, miss. Can you cook, clean, handle household work? The question was so unexpected that Grace could only stare at him for a moment. Yes, she managed finally. I kept house for my aunt and her family. 7 people. I can cook, clean 10 chickens. I've managed a large household. My daughter and I live 5 miles south of here, Benjamin said, gesturing vaguely toward the open country beyond town. Ranch work. Cattle, some horses, chickens, a vegetable garden that's mostly dying because I can't tend it proper. My wife passed 2 years back, and I've been managing poorly ever since. He said it without self-pity, just stating the situation as he might describe the weather. Grace found something steadying in his directness. I could use help, he continued. You need a place to stay. Temporary arrangement till you figure out your next move. You'd work for room and board. Nothing more complicated than that. Henry made a sound of protest. Ben, that's not proper. People will talk. A young unmarried woman staying at your ranch. Let them talk, Benjamin replied, his jaw tightening. They'll talk anyway about what happened here today. At least this way she'll have a roof over her head while they're doing it. Grace's mind struggled to process this sudden shift from complete disaster to unexpected offer. She wanted to ask questions to understand this man's motivations, to know if she was trading one dangerous situation for another. But the platform was empty now, except for them. The sun was relentless, and she had nowhere else to go. The child Lily moved closer, her small hand reaching out but not quite touching Grace's skirt. We have a really big garden, she said, her voice carrying the earnestness of childhood. But it's sad. Papa says plants don't like him. Do you like gardens? Something about the girl's innocent question cut through Grace's paralysis. She looked down at Lily's upturned face, at the hope there, and felt a crack form in the wall of shock she'd been hiding behind. I do like gardens, Grace heard herself say. I helped my mother with hers when I was your age. Lily's face lit up. Papa, she said, tugging on Benjamin's hand, I think she should come home with us. That's about that Lady Benjamin has set his eyes still on Grace. He wasn't pushing. He was simply offering. The choice was entirely hers. Grace thought about her alternatives. The boarding house that Eleanor claimed was full, which may or may not have been true. The evening train back to Denver with no money for a ticket. The streets of an unfamiliar town with no prospects and no connections. Or this a stranger's offer of work in exchange for shelter 5 miles from anywhere, with no guarantee of safety or propriety. But something in Benjamin Cole's steady gaze suggested reliability. Something in the way his daughter held his hand suggested safety. And something in Grace's own exhausted, desperate heart suggested that sometimes Providence came in unexpected forms. I'll come, she said quietly, and I'll earn my keep. I promise you that. Benjamin nodded once as if they'd just concluded a business transaction. Nothing more, nothing less. Wagon's just down the street, he said. We'll get you settled before dark. As they walked toward town, Lily slipped her small hand into Grace's. The gesture was so natural, so trusting, that Grace felt something crack open in her chest. All the fear and humiliation and desperate uncertainty found a small outlet in the warmth of a child's hand. Behind them, Henry called out something about being careful about considering the propriety of the situation. But his voice faded as they moved away from the platform, away from the sight of Grace's public rejection toward a future she couldn't begin to imagine. The wagon was exactly what Grace expected, functional and worn-built for work rather than comfort. Benjamin lifted Lily into the back with easy strength, then turned to help Grace up. His hands on her waist were brief and impersonal, but even that simple touch felt strange after months of living in her aunt's house, where she'd been treated like an inconvenient ghost. Thank you, Grace said as she settled onto the hard bench seat. For this, for not leaving me there. Benjamin climbed up beside her and gathered the reins. A man who'd leave a woman stranded isn't a man worth knowing, he said flatly. William Garrett just showed everyone exactly what he's made of. And it isn't much. They pulled away from town as the afternoon sun painted everything in shades of gold and amber. Grace watched the buildings recede, watched the platform where her future had shattered become just another point in the landscape. She thought about Garrett tearing her photograph, about Eleanor's sharp satisfaction, about the weight of being found wanting. But she also thought about Benjamin's quiet anger on her behalf, about Lily's hand in hers, about the possibility, however slim, that sometimes the worst moments open doors to something better. The road south cut through open grassland that rolled away toward distant mountains. The air smelled of washiwa and dust and something else, a wildness that had no name, but that Grace could taste with every breath. The heat pressed down relentlessly, but there was a beauty to it too, a harsh grandeur that made her feel very small and somehow paradoxically less alone. From the back of the wagon, Lily chattered about the ranch. She talked about the chickens and their names, about the garden and what used to grow there, about her favorite horse, a gentle mare called Clover. Benjamin drove in silence, his attention on the road, but Grace sensed he was listening to his daughter's words with the careful attention of a man who'd learned to treasure them. We had a housekeeper for a while, Lily said suddenly, her voice taking on a more serious tone. Mrs. Patterson. But she left because she said Papa was too quiet and the ranch was too lonely. Lily, Benjamin said, warning in his voice, but also resignation. The tone of a father who'd learned his daughter would say exactly what she thought regardless of redirection. It's true, Papa, Lily insisted. She said you didn't talk enough, and there was nothing to do except work. She leaned forward so her small face appeared between Grace and Benjamin. Are you going to leave too? The question was so direct, so vulnerably honest, that Grace felt her throat tighten. She turned to look at the child, at the worry barely hidden beneath her brave expression. Here was someone who'd already lost one important person and feared losing another. I don't know what the future holds, Grace said carefully, choosing honesty over false comfort. But I'm here now and I'll work as hard as I can for as long as I stay. That's all I can promise. Lily seemed to accept this, settling back into the wagon bed. She began humming a tuneless song that drifted away on the hot wind. Grace and Benjamin rode in silence for a long stretch, the only sounds the creak of the wagon, the steady clip of hooves, and the occasional call of a bird from the scrubland. Grace felt the last of her adrenaline fade, leaving behind a bone-deep exhaustion that made even sitting upright feel like an effort. The morning's hope had curdled into afternoon's humiliation and now evening's strange new reality. Her mind kept trying to process it all, but the pieces wouldn't fit together into anything coherent. "You'll have your own room," Benjamin said, finally breaking the silence. "It's not much. Used to be storage, but it has a window and a bed. You'll take meals with us. Work will be sunrise to sundown most days. Sundays off except for essential chores." He was outlining terms, establishing boundaries, making sure she understood this was an employment arrangement and nothing else. Grace appreciated the clarity. After the chaos of the day, there was comfort in simple direct communication. "That's more than fair," she said. "It's what's right," Benjamin replied. He glanced at her briefly, then back to the road. "I won't have people saying I took advantage of your situation. You work, you get room and board. We'll figure out wages once I see what you can do." "That agreeable?" "Yes." Benjamin seemed to wrestle with something for a moment, his jaw working as if he was choosing his words carefully. "About what happened back there," he said finally. "With Garrett. What he did was cruelty, plain and simple. Had nothing to do with you and everything to do with him being a small man with a smaller heart. I want you to know that." The unexpected kindness in his words nearly undid her. Grace stared straight ahead, willing herself not to cry, not to fall apart now, when she'd managed to hold herself together through everything else. "He looked at me like I was livestock that didn't meet standards," she said quietly. "Then he's a fool," Benjamin stated simply. "A woman's worth isn't in her face or her figure. It's in her character, her strength, what she does when life gets hard." He paused and Grace felt his eyes on her profile. "You stood on that platform with everyone watching, no money, no prospects, and you didn't fall apart. That tells me more about who you are than any photograph ever could." Grace did cry then, but quietly letting the tears slip down her face without wiping them away. They were different from the tears she'd fought back earlier. These weren't tears of humiliation, but of something like relief, or perhaps just the release of tension she hadn't known she was carrying. Behind them, Lily started singing again, something about mockingbirds and diamond rings, her child's voice pure and unself-conscious. The sun continued its descent, painting the grassland in deeper shades of gold. And Grace Winters, who'd started the day expecting to become someone's wife, let herself cry for the future she'd lost, while riding toward a future she couldn't yet imagine. The ranch appeared as the sun touched the western mountains, a cluster of buildings that looked weathered but solid, built to withstand seasons and storms. The main house was larger than Grace expected, 2 stories of dark wood with a wide porch that wrapped around the front. A barn stood off to one side, substantial and well-maintained. Beyond it, Grace could see a corral with several horses, smaller outbuildings, and the neat rows of what must be the struggling vegetable garden Benjamin had mentioned. As they drew closer, Grace could see the signs of a place where one man was trying to do the work of 3. Fences that needed mending, shutters that hung slightly askew, weeds encroaching on the garden beds. But there was also evidence of care. The barn roof was sound. The animals in the corral looked healthy. Despite the wear, everything had the air of a working ranch rather than a neglected one. Benjamin pulled the wagon to a stop near the house and helped first Lily, then Grace down. The child immediately ran toward the barn, calling out to the horses. Benjamin watched her go with an expression Grace was learning to recognize. Love mixed with a kind of helpless uncertainty, as if he was never quite sure he was raising her right. "Come on," he said, picking up Grace's carpet bag. "I'll show you around." The house was dim and cool after the bright heat outside. Grace's eyes adjusted slowly, revealing a large main room that served as both kitchen and living area. A stone fireplace dominated one wall. Rough-hewn furniture filled the space. Table chairs, a worn sofa. Everything was clean but spare functional rather than comfortable. There were no curtains on the windows, no rugs on the floor, none of the small touches that made a house feel like a home. "Kitchen's there, obviously," Benjamin said, gesturing to the area where a cast-iron stove stood, beside shelves of basic supplies, pumps out back for water. "Pantry's stocked well enough, though I'm no cook, so meals have been simple." He led her up a narrow staircase to the second floor where 3 doors opened off a small hallway. "Lily's room," he said, indicating the first. "My room, and this one here." He opened the third door, revealing a small space with a single bed, a dresser, and a window that looked out toward the mountains. It's not much, he said again, but it's yours for as long as you need it. Grace stepped into the room and set her carpet bag on the bed. The space was indeed small, barely large enough for the furniture it contained. But it had a window with real glass and a door that closed, and that was more privacy than she'd had in her aunt's house, where she'd slept in a corner of the attic. It's perfect, she said quietly. Thank you. When she turned, Benjamin was watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read. You've had a hell of a day, he said. Why don't you rest for a bit? Get yourself settled. I'll call you when supper's ready. But Grace shook her head. I'd rather work if it's all the same to you. I think I need to do something useful. Understanding flickered across Benjamin's face. He nodded. All right then, let's start with supper. Show me what you can do with beans and salt pork. They went back downstairs together and Grace surveyed the kitchen with the practiced eye of someone who'd been cooking since she was tall enough to reach the stove. The basics were there, good cookware though it needed a thorough cleaning. Adequate supplies, even some herbs hanging dried near the window. She could work with this. As she tied on an apron she found hanging on a peg and began pulling out what she needed, Benjamin leaned against the doorframe watching. You know what you're doing, he observed. I kept house for my aunt and her family, Grace said, beginning to slice salt pork with efficient movements. 7 people total, all of them particular about their meals. I learned young that if you want peace, you make sure the food is good. Your Aunt Benjamin said casually, but Grace sensed the weight behind it. She treat you well? Grace considered lying, smoothing over the truth with platitudes about family duty and gratitude. But something about this man's direct honesty seemed to demand the same in return. She gave me a place to live after my parents died. Grace set her focus on the salt pork, cutting it into precise cubes. I'm grateful for that. But no, she didn't treat me well. I was convenient free labor, someone to mind the children and do the washing and disappear when company came because I was a poor relation, and that reflected badly. The words came out more bitter than she intended. Grace moved to the stove, stoking the fire, channeling her emotions into the knife work. So you took the first escape you could find, Benjamin said softly, even if it meant marrying a stranger, even if it meant that Grace confirmed. She moved beans into a pot with water, adding some of the dried herbs. I thought it would be a fresh start, a chance to build something of my own, to matter to someone, and instead you got William Garrett. Instead I got humiliated in front of half the town. Grace's hand stilled on the skillet. Do you know him, Garrett, well enough to know you're better off without him? Benjamin said, his voice going hard again. He runs the feed store, thinks highly of himself, treats his employees poorly. Word is he's been through 2 mail-order arrangements before this one. Grace absorbed this, trying to reconcile it with the man who'd carefully composed letters about building a life together, about wanting a partner, about being lonely in this big country. He wrote such nice letters, she said quietly. I imagine he did, Benjamin replied. Some men are better on paper than in person. He pushed off from the doorframe. I'll let you work. Holler if you need anything. He left her alone in the kitchen, and Grace let herself sink into the familiar rhythm of cooking. She fried the salt pork until it was crisp, then used the fat to saute wild onions she found in the pantry. The beans went into a pot with water, some of the herbs, a pinch of precious sugar to cut the bitterness. While everything simmered, she made biscuits from flour lard and buttermilk, her hands remembering the proportions her mother had taught her years ago. As she worked, Lily wandered in and out, fascinated by the activity. The girl was obviously starved for female company, asking questions about everything. Where Grace was from, what Philadelphia was like, whether she knew any songs, whether she could braid hair better than Papa could. Papa tries, Lily confided, perching on a chair to watch Grace roll out biscuit dough. But his fingers are too big and the braids always come loose. Sometimes I do them myself, but they're all crooked. I could braid your hair tomorrow morning if you'd like, Grace offered. Mia's face lit up with such pure joy that Grace felt her battered heart expand slightly. Really, you mean it? I mean it. The child's delight was almost painful to witness. Here was someone who wanted Grace here, who didn't find her lacking. This child at least was glad she'd come. Supper was ready as the last light faded from the sky. Grace called Benjamin in from whatever work he had been doing in the barn, and they sat down together at the rough table. The taciturn rancher, his talkative daughter, and the woman who'd been rejected that afternoon and somehow impossibly found herself here. Benjamin took his first bite of beans and went still. He looked at Grace with something like surprise crossing his weathered features. "This is good," he said. "Really good. It's just beans and salt pork. It's the first meal I've had in 2 years that tasted like something worth eating," Benjamin said, taking another bite. "Mrs. Patterson couldn't cook worth a damn, and I'm worse. We've been surviving on charred meat and burnt biscuits for a long while now." Lily nodded enthusiastically, her mouth full. When she swallowed, she announced, "Papa makes everything taste like smoke. I do not." "You do, Papa. Even the eggs taste like smoke." Despite everything, the exhaustion, the lingering humiliation, the strangeness of being in this place with these people, Grace found herself smiling. There was something deeply normal about this exchange, something grounding about sitting at a table and sharing a meal while a child teased her father. They ate in comfortable silence for a while, the kind that came not from having nothing to say, but from being tired and hungry and focused on the food. When they finished, Grace stood to clear the dishes, but Benjamin stopped her with a raised hand. "You cooked," he said. "Lily and I will clean up. That's how it works here. Everyone contributes." So Grace watched as the big rancher and his small daughter worked together to clear the table and wash the dishes. Their movements were practiced and comfortable, a father and child who'd learned to take care of each other. Lily stood on a stool to reach the washing basin, and Benjamin dried with a dish towel, and the simple domesticity of it all made Grace's eyes sting with tears she didn't quite understand. When the kitchen was clean, Benjamin sent Lily upstairs to get ready for bed. The girl hugged Grace goodnight, a fierce, spontaneous embrace that nearly knocked her backward, then thundered up the stairs with the unself-conscious noise of a happy child. Alone with Benjamin, again Grace felt suddenly awkward. The evening had taken on an intimacy she hadn't anticipated. Sitting at his table, feeding his child, watching him move through his home. She was a stranger here, she reminded herself. An employee, nothing more. "You must be exhausted," Benjamin said, seeming to sense her discomfort. "Tomorrow will be soon enough to talk about work. Tonight, just rest." "Thank you," Grace said. She hesitated, then asked the question that had been building since they left town. "Why did you help me? You don't know anything about me. I could be anyone." Benjamin considered this, his gray eyes thoughtful in the lamplight. "My wife," he said finally. "She came west as a mail-order bride, too. That's how we met." Grace waited, sensing there was more. Rebecca arrived in Copper Ridge with nothing but a carpet bag and a lot of hope. Benjamin continued. Her intended had died 2 weeks before. "Influenza. She was stranded, same as you." He paused, his throat working. "A man named Thomas Webb took her in, let her work his ranch till she figured out her next move. I was Webb's ranch hand back then. That's how Rebecca and I met. We worked side by side for 6 months before I got up the courage to court her proper." His voice had gone soft with memory. "She was the best thing that ever happened to me. And if someone hadn't helped her when she arrived, hadn't stepped in when she needed it, I'd never have met her. I'd never have had those years with her. Never have had Lily." Benjamin looked directly at Grace. "When I saw you on that platform today, I saw her. I saw what could have happened if no one had been decent enough to help. And I couldn't walk away from that." The confession hung in the air between them, heavy with memory and loss. Grace understood then that this offer of refuge was about more than kindness. It was about honoring the memory of someone who'd needed help once and received it. "I'm sorry," Grace said softly. "About your wife." "So am I," Benjamin replied. He turned away, but not before Grace saw the flash of pain across his face. "Get some rest. Morning comes early on a ranch." Grace climbed the stairs to her small room, her body finally beginning to register the full weight of the day's events. She changed into her nightgown, washed her face with water from the pitcher on the dresser, and sat on the edge of the narrow bed. Through the window, she could see stars beginning to appear in the darkening sky. More stars than she'd ever seen in Philadelphia scattered across the heavens, like diamonds on velvet. Somewhere out there was the town where she'd been rejected. Somewhere out there was William Garrett, probably already forgetting the woman he'd dismissed. And somewhere out there was the future she'd imagined dissolving like mist. But here in this small room in this weathered ranch house was a different kind of future. Uncertain and undefined, built on nothing more solid than a stranger's kindness and a child's need. Grace wasn't naive enough to think this arrangement would last forever, or that she'd found some fairy tale ending to her disaster. But for tonight, she had a bed and a roof and the lingering warmth of being treated with basic human decency. It was enough. For now, it was enough. She lay down and closed her eyes, and despite everything, despite the trauma and uncertainty and fear, she fell asleep almost immediately. Exhausted by loss, lulled by the unfamiliar sounds of this new place. Wind in the grass, the distant lowing of cattle, and below her window, the quiet footsteps of a man checking locks and banking fires before heading to his own lonely bed. Grace woke to bird song and the creak of floorboards below. For a moment, she lay disoriented in the pre-dawn darkness, unable to place herself. Then memory returned in a cold rush. The platform, the torn photograph, William Garrett's dismissive glance. She sat up quickly as if movement could outrun the shame that came with remembering. Through the window, the sky was beginning to lighten at the edges, turning from black to deep blue. Grace dressed quickly in the dim light, choosing her older work dress and pinning her hair back with shaking fingers. Her reflection in the small mirror above the dresser showed a face that looked hollowed out by exhaustion, dark circles under eyes that seemed too large. She looked away. Downstairs, she found Benjamin already in the kitchen attempting to start the stove with the grim determination of a man who'd failed at this task many times before. He looked up when she entered, surprise flickering across his weathered features. "Didn't expect you up this early," he said. "I'm used to early mornings," Grace replied, moving toward the stove without thinking. Years of household routine took over. "Let me." She had the fire going properly within minutes, working with practiced efficiency while Benjamin watched from the doorway. The kitchen began to warm as she pulled out flour and eggs, moving through the space as if taking inventory of its possibilities. "Coffee's in the blue tin," Benjamin offered. "Though fair warning, I make it strong enough to strip paint." "Strong is fine," Grace said. She found the tin and measured grounds into the pot, adding water from the pump. "When does Lily wake?" "Depends on the day," Benjamin replied. "Sometimes dawn, sometimes not, till the sun's well up." He paused. "She'll want those braids you promised." The simple statement carried unexpected weight, a reminder that Grace's words mattered here, that someone was counting on her to keep them. She nodded, focusing on slicing salt pork for breakfast. The familiar work steadied her, gave her hands something to do while her mind tried to make sense of this new reality. They worked in companionable silence, Benjamin eventually settling at the table with his coffee while Grace cooked. The eastern sky turned gold, then pink light spilling through the windows and illuminating dust motes that danced in the air. There was something peaceful about this hour, Grace thought. Something that felt suspended between yesterday's disaster and whatever today would bring. Lily appeared as Grace was plating eggs and fried pork. The girl's hair was a wild tangle around her sleep-flushed face, and she climbed into her father's lap without preamble, burying her face in his shoulder. "Morning, little bird," Benjamin murmured, his voice taking on a gentleness that transformed his whole presence. Grace made breakfast. The child peered at the table, then at Grace, as if testing whether yesterday had been real or dreamed. "You stayed," she said finally. "I did," good Lily said, with the decisive air of someone who'd made an important decision. She slid from her father's lap into her own chair. "Can you really braid hair?" After breakfast, Grace sat Lily on a stool near the window and carefully worked through the tangles in the child's dark hair. Benjamin had left for the barn, but Grace could hear him moving around outside, the sounds of morning chores beginning. She separated Lily's hair into sections, her fingers remembering the motions her mother had taught her long ago. "Mama used to do this," Lily said quietly, "but I don't remember it very well. Just the feeling, sort of like being safe." Grace's hand stilled for a moment. "How old were you when she passed?" 4.5. Lily's voice was matter-of-fact, but Grace heard the loss underneath. "Papa says I look like her, but I don't remember her face exactly. Just pieces. Her singing, the way she smelled like bread and soap." "Do you miss her every day?" Grace said softly, resuming her work on the braids. "She died when I was 16. My father, too. They went within days of each other." "That's sad," Lily said. Then with a child's directness, "Papa gets sad sometimes. He tries to hide it, but I can tell. He goes real quiet and his eyes look far away." The child's perceptiveness caught Grace off guard. She finished the first braid and started on the second, choosing her words carefully. "Losing someone you love is hard. It takes a long time to stop hurting. Has it stopped hurting for you? Not completely, but it hurts less than it used to. And I can remember the good things now without just feeling pain." Lily absorbed this, tilting her head to examine her reflection in the window glass. "Will Papa stop hurting someday?" "I think so," Grace said. People are stronger than they know. When both braids were finished, Lily jumped down and ran to the small mirror hanging near the door. She turned her head from side to side, admiring the work with obvious delight. "They're perfect," she announced. "They're so neat and pretty, and they're not crooked at all." She spun around, her whole face lit with joy. "Can you do them every morning?" "We'll see," Grace said, unwilling to make promises about a future she couldn't predict. "For now, why don't you show me that garden your papa mentioned?" The vegetable garden was indeed struggling. Grace surveyed the rows with a critical eye, noting the weeds choking the bean plants, the tomatoes desperate for water, the squash vines wilting in soil that had gone hard and cracked. But underneath the neglect, she could see the bones of a good garden. Someone had laid it out well, had known what they were doing. "Mama planted this," Lily said, echoing Grace's thoughts. "Papa keeps trying, but he says plants don't like him the way they liked her." "Plants don't like or dislike anyone," Grace said, kneeling beside a struggling tomato plant and testing the soil with her fingers. "Dry as dust. They just need the right care. Your papa's been doing the work of 3 people." Something had to give. She stood shading her eyes against the climbing sun as she looked around the property. Beyond the garden, she could see the chicken coop, the barn, where Benjamin had disappeared, the corral, where several horses stood in drowsy morning contentment. It was a good piece of land, well situated, and clearly once well tended. The evidence of decline was everywhere. A fence section, sagging shutters hanging askew, the porch steps worn and splintering. But it wasn't beyond saving, not yet. "Can you fix it?" Lily asked, watching Grace with eyes too old for her young face. "The garden, I mean. Can you make it like it was?" "I can try," Grace said, meeting the child's earnest gaze. "But it will take work, a lot of work." "I can help," Lily announced with the confidence of childhood. "I'm a very good helper. Papa says so. Then we'd better get started." They worked through the morning as the summer heat built, Grace pulling weeds while Lily hauled water in a bucket she could barely carry. The child was indeed a good helper, tireless and cheerful, chattering constantly about the ranch, her father, the horses, and a dozen other topics that seemed to have no particular order or connection. Grace listened with half her attention while her hands fell into the rhythm of the work. Pull, toss, the weeds coming up in satisfying clumps. Benjamin appeared around mid-morning, his shirt dark with sweat and his hat pushed back. He stopped at the edge of the garden, taking in the neat rows Grace had already cleared the pile of weeds wilting in the sun. "You don't have to do this," he said. "I hired you for housework, not field labor." Grace sat back on her heels, wiping her forehead with the back of her hand. "A garden is a garden, seems a shame to let it die when it could be saved." He studied her for a long moment, something unreadable moving behind his eyes. Then he nodded slowly. "Water barrels are around back. Pump's been working steady. You need anything else, come find me in the barn." As he turned to go, Grace called out, "Mr. Cole." He paused, looking back. "What should I call you?" "Mr. Cole seems too formal for someone living in your house." Benjamin seemed to consider this. "Caleb's fine," he said finally. Then catching himself, "Ben. People call me Ben. We're not formal out here." "Grace," she said, testing his name, finding it fit him. Solid and unpretentious. "And I'm Grace," I know, he replied, and something that might have been humor flickered in his eyes. "You told me yesterday." On the platform, he left before she could respond, his long strides carrying him back toward the barn. Lily giggled, covering her mouth with dirty hands. "Papa's being shy," she announced. "He's not used to ladies." "I'm not a lady," Grace said. "I'm just someone who needed help." "You're a lady to me," Lily insisted, picking up her bucket with renewed determination. "Come on, the tomatoes are thirsty." By midday, Grace had cleared 3 full rows and watered everything she'd uncovered. Her back ached, her hands were filthy, and her dress was soaked with sweat, but the garden looked measurably better. She could see the potential, now could imagine what it might look like in a few weeks with proper care. Neat rows of vegetables, vines, heavy with produce, the earth dark and healthy. She sent Lily to wash up and headed inside to start dinner, moving through the hot kitchen with mechanical efficiency. Her mind kept returning to the platform, to William Garrett's dismissive glance, to the weight of being found wanting. But each time the memory threatened to overwhelm her, she forced her attention back to the present. The onions she was chopping, the bread dough she was kneading, the simple fact of being here, doing something useful, mattering in some small way. Dinner was beans and cornbread served at the rough table while the afternoon heat pressed against the windows. Ben ate with the single-minded focus of someone who viewed food as fuel rather than pleasure, but he cleaned his plate and accepted seconds without comment. Lily kept up a steady stream of conversation, telling her father about everything they'd accomplished in the garden. Grace says the tomatoes will have fruit soon if we keep watering them, the girl reported. And the beans aren't dead, they're just, we're going to make them happy again. Is that so? Ben's gaze shifted to Grace. You know about gardens? My mother had one, Grace said, breaking off a piece of cornbread. I helped her tend it from the time I was small. She paused, remembering her mother's hands in the soil, her patient instruction. A garden is like anything else. It responds to attention. Neglect it, and it dies. But give it consistent care, and it thrives. Sounds like raising children, Ben said quietly, or building a life. The statement hung in the air heavier than Grace had intended. She hadn't meant to make a commentary on his situation, on the evidence of struggle she saw everywhere. But the words were out now, unavoidable. You can't abandon something and expect it to flourish, Grace said softly. Ben's expression shifted, something complicated moving behind his eyes. Recognition, perhaps, or understanding of all the things she wasn't saying about yesterday, about being abandoned, about trying to build something from nothing. No, he agreed finally. You can't. The moment passed, but Grace felt that something had shifted between them. Some acknowledgement of shared understanding of pain, recognized and witnessed. After dinner, Grace cleaned the kitchen while Ben disappeared to handle afternoon chores. Lily settled at the table with a slate and chalk, practicing letters with fierce concentration. Grace watched her from the corner of her eye as she worked, noting the way the child formed each character with painstaking care, her tongue caught between her teeth. Do you go to school? Grace asked. Lily shook her head without looking up. There's a school in town, but Papa says it's too far to ride every day, especially in winter. Mrs. Patterson taught me some, but she wasn't very patient. She said I was slow. May I see? Lily pushed the slate across the table, her expression anxious. Grace studied the letters. They were wobbly but recognizable, showing effort if not expertise. For a child who'd had inconsistent instruction, they were actually quite good. You're not slow, Grace said firmly. You just need practice. Would you like help? The girl's face transformed with hope. Really, you'd teach me? I'm not a real teacher, Grace cautioned, but I can show you what I know. They spent the next hour working together, Grace gently correcting Lily's letter formation, while the afternoon light slanted through the windows. It was peaceful work, quieter than the garden, but equally satisfying. The child was bright and eager, soaking up instruction, like dry ground soaking up rain. When Ben returned, he found them bent over the slate together, Lily carefully copying a simple sentence Grace had written. He stopped in the doorway and Grace looked up to find him watching them with an expression she couldn't decipher. Something between gratitude and pain, as if the simple domestic scene touched a wound he'd been trying to ignore. Time for chores, little bird, he said quietly. Lily groaned but obeyed, sliding from her chair with the dramatic reluctance of childhood. Can we do more letters tomorrow if your father doesn't mind? I don't mind, Ben said, his voice rough. He cleared his throat. Come on, Lily. Chickens need feeding. Father and daughter headed out together, and Grace watched them through the window. The tall man and the small girl moving in comfortable synchronization toward the chicken coop. There was love in every gesture, in the way Ben automatically adjusted his stride to match Lily's shorter steps, in the way the child looked up at her father with absolute trust. Grace turned away, fighting an unexpected ache in her chest. She'd thought she was past wanting things for herself, past hoping for connection and belonging. But watching Ben and Lily together stirred something she'd tried to bury. The longing to be part of something, to matter to someone, to build a life that meant more than just surviving day to day. She shook her head, clearing away the dangerous thoughts. She was here temporarily until she could figure out her next move. Getting attached, letting herself hope that way, lay only more heartbreak. The evening passed in quiet routine. After chores, they had a light supper of leftover cornbread and milk. Lily was tired, her earlier energy fading as the day's heat finally began to break. Ben sent her to bed early, and Grace heard him upstairs, his deep voice reading something that made Lily giggle. When he came back down, Grace was finishing the dishes, the kitchen clean, and ready for tomorrow. Ben poured himself coffee from the pot that was always simmering on the stove and settled into one of the chairs by the cold fireplace. His posture showed the bone-deep weariness of hard physical labor. She likes you, he said without preamble. Grace dried her hands on a towel, unsure how to respond. She's a sweet child. She doesn't take to people easily. Ben continued staring into his coffee cup. Her mother dying, it made her cautious. She doesn't trust that people will stay. Can you blame her? The words came out before Grace could stop them. Ben looked up sharply, then nodded slowly. No, I can't. He paused, seeming to wrestle with something. I want you to know that you can stay as long as you need to, even if the work doesn't suit you, even if this arrangement doesn't work out. I won't turn you out without prospects. Grace moved to the other chair, sitting carefully as if sudden movement might break the fragile honesty of the moment. Why are you being so kind to me? It's not kindness, Ben said, his jaw tightening. It's basic human decency. What Garrett did yesterday, leaving you stranded, that was cruelty. I won't add to it. You barely know me. I know enough, he replied, meeting her eyes directly. I know you stood on that platform with half the town watching and didn't fall apart. I know you've been working since dawn without complaint. I know my daughter hasn't smiled that much in 2 years. He paused. That's enough. Grace felt something loosen in her chest, some tight knot of fear she'd been carrying since the platform. She wouldn't take advantage of his generosity, she promised silently. She would work hard, prove her worth, find a way forward. But for now, for tonight, she had shelter and safety and the unexpected gift of someone who saw her as a person rather than a disappointment. Thank you, she said quietly, for all of this. Ben nodded, draining his coffee. Get some rest. Tomorrow will be another long day. He headed upstairs, leaving Grace alone in the quiet kitchen. Through the open windows, she could hear the night sounds of the ranch. Cattle settling, a horse nickering softly, the distant call of an owl. The unfamiliar sounds should have made her feel more alone, more displaced. Instead, they felt oddly comforting, as if the land itself was breathing around her. She climbed the stairs to her small room and prepared for bed exhaustion, finally catching up with her. But as she lay watching moonlight paint patterns on the wall, her mind wouldn't quiet. She kept thinking about Lily's joy over neat braids, about Ben's rough kindness, about the garden, responding to water and care, about the possibility, however fragile, that maybe she'd found a place where she could be useful, where her presence added something rather than simply taking up space. It wasn't the future she'd imagined when she boarded the train 3 weeks ago, but perhaps it was something better than that, something real built on honest work and mutual need rather than romantic fantasy. The days developed a rhythm. Grace woke before dawn and made breakfast while Ben handled the early barn work. After they ate, she'd spend the morning in the garden or tackling the endless domestic tasks the house required, washing, mending, cleaning spaces that hadn't seen proper attention in 2 years. Afternoons were devoted to Lily's lessons and preparing supper, while evenings passed in quiet routine until darkness sent everyone to bed exhausted by honest labor. The work was relentless, harder than anything Grace had done in her aunt's house. But there was a satisfaction to it that she'd never felt before. In Philadelphia, she'd worked to avoid criticism, to stay invisible, to earn her keep in a household that made clear she was barely tolerated. Here, every task she completed made a visible difference. The garden flourished under her care. Neat rows of vegetables pushed through the soil with renewed vigor. The house slowly transformed from bare functionality to something approaching comfort. Curtains she sewed from old fabric. Rugs she beat clean and repositioned. Small touches that made the space feel lived in rather than simply occupied. Ben watched these changes with quiet approval, occasionally offering help, but mostly letting Grace work at her own pace. He was a man of few words, communicating as much through silence as speech. But Grace learned to read him. The slight softening around his eyes when he was pleased. The tightness in his jaw when something troubled him. The way he'd stand at the window staring at nothing when the weight of memory became too heavy. 3 weeks passed, the routine became comfortable, the work became familiar, and Grace found herself thinking less about William Garrett and what might have been. The shame of that day on the platform still burned when she let herself remember it, but out here on the ranch, surrounded by work and purpose, it mattered less. She was making something here, building something. And that simple fact carried its own kind of healing. It was Lily who finally asked the question Grace had been avoiding. They were working in the garden together, Grace weeding, while the child watered, when Lily said, "Are you going to stay forever?" Grace's hands stilled in the soil. "I don't know, honey. This was always meant to be temporary. But you like it here, don't you? You smile more now than when you first came. The observation caught Grace off guard. She sat back on her heels, looking at the child's earnest face. I do like it here. Very much. Then why would you leave? It was a child's logic, simple and direct, seeing no reason why liking something wouldn't automatically lead to keeping it. Grace struggled to find words that would make sense without crushing the hope she saw in those gray eyes so like Ben's. Sometimes life is more complicated than just liking or not liking something, she said finally. I came here because I had nowhere else to go. Your father gave me shelter when I needed it. But that doesn't mean this is my home forever. It could be though, Lily said, setting down her bucket with a thump. You could stay and be part of our family, like Mama was. Oh, sweetheart. Grace's throat tightened. It's not that simple. Why not? Because I'm still the woman who was rejected on that platform. Grace thought. Because your father doesn't want a wife, he wants help with his ranch. Because I've learned not to hope for things that seem too good to be true. But she couldn't say any of that to a 7-year-old girl who'd already lost too much. We'll see, she said instead, offering the universal parental deflection. For now, let's focus on these tomatoes. They're almost ready to pick. Lily accepted the redirection with the resilience of childhood, but Grace saw her casting sidelong glances throughout the rest of the afternoon as if trying to decipher something in Grace's face. That evening, after Lily had gone to bed, Ben stood by the window longer than usual. The tension in his shoulders was visible even from across the room. Grace continued her mending, giving him space but aware that something was building. Finally, he spoke without turning. Lily asked you to stay. It wasn't a question. Yes, Grace said quietly. What did you tell her that I didn't know what the future held? That this was always meant to be temporary? Ben nodded slowly, his reflection in the dark window troubled. She's getting attached. I should have seen it coming. Grace set down the sock she was mending. Should I pull back? Spend less time with her. The word came out sharply, then softer. No, that would hurt her more. She needs what you've been giving her. Attention, teaching someone who treats her like she matters. She does matter. I know that, Ben said, frustration evident in his voice. But I can't give her everything she needs. I'm trying, but I'm just one person, and I don't know how to be both mother and father, and I can't teach her things I don't know myself, and he stopped, running a hand through his hair. The sentence remained unfinished, but the meaning was clear. Grace stood, moving closer, but maintaining careful distance. You're a good father, Ben. She adores you. Don't doubt that. She needs more than adoration. She needs a mother, Ben said, the words seeming dragged from somewhere deep. And I can't give her that. The kitchen fell silent, except for the tick of the clock and the soft sounds of the summer night beyond the windows. Grace felt the weight of unspoken things pressing against the air between them, the complicated tangle of need and grief and the simple human longing for connection. I don't know how long can stay, she said quietly. I don't know what I'm building toward or where I'll end up. But while I'm here, I'll care for her as best I can. I promise you that. Ben nodded slowly, something like relief crossing his features. That's all I'm asking. But Grace suspected it wasn't all he was asking, just all he could bring himself to say. She suspected there was more beneath the surface. Questions about the future, about possibility, about whether this temporary arrangement might become something else. She suspected it because she felt it too. The dangerous pull of wanting this to be more than it was, of imagining a future that included this ranch, this child, this silent man with his weathered hands and careful heart. But wanting and having were different things, and Grace had learned that lesson too well to forget it now. The 3 weeks since her arrival had changed her. The broken woman who'd stood on that platform with a torn photograph seemed like someone else now. Someone smaller, more frightened, less certain of her own strength. Grace Winters had survived the worst day of her life and found in surviving it the first threads of something that might eventually feel like home. Whether that would be enough, whether temporary could become permanent, remained to be seen. But as she lay in her small room that night, listening to the familiar sounds of the ranch settling into darkness, Grace allowed herself the smallest flicker of hope, not for romance or rescue, but for the possibility that sometimes providence came disguised as rejection, that sometimes being left behind was the first step toward finding where you truly belonged. The summer stretched ahead of them, full of work and heat and the endless cycle of ranch life. Whatever came next, Grace would face it with her eyes open and her spine straight. She'd come to Montana with nothing but a torn photograph and broken dreams. She was building something now, day by day with her own hands, and that for now was enough. The fourth week arrived with a settling, as if the ranch itself had accepted Grace's presence and stopped questioning whether she belonged. The mornings came easier now. Grace no longer woke disoriented, reaching for bearings in unfamiliar darkness. Her body had learned the rhythms of this place, rising before dawn, without effort, moving through the house with growing confidence. She and Ben had developed a comfortable pattern. Coffee ready when he came in from the early barn check. Breakfast together with minimal conversation, but increasing ease. Small gestures of consideration. Ben filling the wood box without being asked. Grace setting his work gloves where he'd find them. The quiet choreography of two people learning to share space. Lily's lessons had progressed beyond simple letters. The child was reading short passages now, her confidence growing daily. Grace found herself looking forward to their afternoon sessions, watching Lily's face light up when she successfully worked through a difficult word. One Saturday morning, Ben announced they needed to go into Copper Ridge for supplies. Grace felt her stomach tighten at the thought of returning to town, to the platform where she'd been so publicly rejected. But Ben seemed to sense her hesitation. "You don't have to come if you'd rather not," he said, "but I thought you might want to pick out fabric for Lily. She's growing fast and her dresses are getting short." The practical consideration, the assumption that Grace would be the one making Lily's clothes, felt like trust. Grace nodded. "I'll come." The wagon ride into town felt different from that first desperate journey. Then Grace had been fleeing disaster with nowhere to go. Now she rode beside Ben, with Lily chattering from the wagon bed, part of something, rather than running from everything. Copper Ridge's main street bustled with Saturday morning activity. Ranchers and their families stocking up for the week ahead. Children darting between wagons. The general hum of a small community conducting its business. Grace felt eyes turned toward them as Ben pulled up in front of Morrison's general store, felt the weight of curious stares and whispered speculation. Ben climbed down and helped Grace descend, his hand steady on her elbow. Lily jumped from the wagon bed with the fearless energy of childhood, already pulling Grace toward the store entrance. They were examining bolts of fabric when Eleanor Patterson's voice cut through the store's ambient noise. "Well, Grace Winters, still staying at the coal ranch, I see. Quite the extended arrangement." Grace turned slowly. Eleanor stood near the counter, perfectly positioned to be heard by the half-dozen other customers browsing the store. Her smile held no warmth, only the sharp satisfaction of someone about to draw blood in public. "Mrs. Patterson," Grace said evenly, "how convenient that you landed so comfortably after your disappointment." Eleanor continued, her voice pitched to Carrie. "Some might say suspiciously convenient. A young unmarried woman living with a widower and his child. People do talk, you know." The implication was clear as glass. Grace felt heat climb her neck, felt the attention of every person in the store focus on her. She was being accused of impropriety, of trapping Ben somehow, of turning disaster into manipulation. "Mrs. Patterson," Grace said carefully, keeping her voice level, "Mr. Cole offered me work. I accepted. There's nothing suspicious about honest labor." "Of course not," dear Eleanor replied with false sweetness, "though one does wonder about appearances. Propriety matters in a community like ours." Ben appeared beside Grace so suddenly that Eleanor actually stepped back. He'd been outside checking on a feed order, but now stood with his shoulder nearly touching Grace's, a wall of solid presence. "Mrs. Patterson," he said, his voice quiet but carrying an edge that made several people turn. "Mrs. Winters works on my ranch. She keeps my house, tends my garden, and teaches my daughter. That's all anyone needs to know. If people want to talk, they can talk. Won't change the facts." Eleanor's face flushed. "I didn't mean offense, Ben. I'm simply concerned about propriety." "Your concern is noted," Ben said flatly and dismissed. He placed his hand on the small of Grace's back, a gesture both protective and possessive. "Grace, didn't you want to look at that blue fabric for Lily?" The touch sent awareness through Grace like lightning, not because it was intimate, but because it was public. Ben was making a statement, claiming her in a sense as someone under his protection. Someone who didn't deserve Eleanor's insinuations. They finished their shopping in tense silence, Eleanor watching from across the store with narrowed eyes. When they finally loaded their purchases into the wagon, Grace felt she could breathe again. "You didn't have to do that," she said as they pulled away from town. "Yes, I did," Ben replied, not looking at her. His jaw was set, hands tight on the reins. "People like Eleanor thrive on making others feel small. She won't do that to you, not after what you've already been through." Grace studied his profile, seeing anger there, but also something deeper: loyalty, protection, a fierce determination to defend what he considered his. "Thank you," she said quietly. Ben nodded once, subject closed. But something had shifted between them, something that felt both dangerous and inevitable. July arrived with heat that seemed to have weight and texture. By mid-morning, the air shimmered over the grassland, turning the distant mountains into wavering mirages. Grace adjusted her routine, rising even earlier to accomplish as much as possible before the worst heat descended. Ben worked himself ruthlessly, checking cattle in the brutal sun, hauling water to troughs that needed constant refilling, repairing fence lines that seemed to warp and crack in the relentless temperature. He came in at midday, soaked through with sweat, his face dark red from sun and exertion, drinking dipper after dipper of water before heading back out. Grace watched him with growing concern. He was pushing too hard, sleeping too little, burning himself out. But when she suggested he rest during the peak heat hours, he simply shook his head. "Cattle don't care about heat," he said. "They need water and shade, or they die." By the fourth day of the heat wave, Grace noticed Lily wasn't herself. The child was listless, lying on the floor in the coolest part of the house rather than bouncing with her usual energy. "I'm hot," Grace Lily complained. "I'm so hot." "I know, sweetheart," Grace said, bringing her another cup of water. "Drink this for me." She pressed the back of her hand to Lily's forehead. Warm, but everyone was warm in this oppressive heat. Still, something about the child's flushed cheeks and glassy eyes made unease prickle at the base of Grace's spine. By evening, Lily picked at her supper without interest. "My tummy feels funny," she said, "and my head hurts." Ben's eyes met Grace's across the table, concern evident. "Keep her drinking water," he said. "Heat exhaustion can come on fast in children." But when Grace checked on Lily before bed, the child's skin was burning. Not the ambient warmth of overheated air, but the distinct fever heat of illness. Real illness. Grace's heart began to hammer. "Ben," she called down the stairs, trying to keep panic from her voice. "I need you up here." Ben took the stairs two at a time. He knelt beside Lily's bed, his large hand gentle on her forehead, and went completely still. "How long has she had fever?" "Just noticed it now," Grace said. "Past hour, maybe." Ben's face had drained of all color. His hand was trembling against Lily's skin. When he spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "This is how it started with Rebecca." Grace felt cold despite the oppressive heat. "What do you mean?" Ben pulled Grace out into the hallway, his movements jerky with barely controlled fear. "Summer heat," he said, the words coming fast and rough. Rebecca complained of headache, said it was nothing. By evening, fever was 104. Next day, higher. The doctor said it was scarlet fever. His eyes, when he looked at Grace, held a terror so profound it was painful to witness. By the time we got her to town, it was too late. Fever had been too high for too long. She lasted 3 days total, from first symptom to... He couldn't finish the sentence. "Didn't need to. I waited." Ben continued, his voice breaking. "I thought it was just summer cold. I didn't want to overreact. I waited too long. And now Lily has the same symptoms, and I can't lose her, Grace. I can't." Grace felt fear slam through her chest, but forced herself to think past it. To be practical. "The doctor's in town. 20 miles on horseback in this heat, 3 hours minimum each way," Ben said. "Maybe more if his horse struggles. 6, 7 hours round trip." Grace did the mathematics in her head. If Lily had what Rebecca had, if the fever could kill in 3 days, then every hour mattered. Waiting 6 or 7 hours for the doctor might be 6 or 7 hours too long. "We fight it here," Grace said, surprised by the steadiness in her own voice. "Now, we don't wait." "But the doctor," Ben started. "By the time you get back, it might be too late," Grace said. "We know what to do: break the fever, keep her hydrated, watch for complications." That's what the doctor would do anyway. Ben looked torn between action and helplessness, between the urge to do something and the fear of doing the wrong thing. "I need you here," Grace said firmly, taking his hands. "With me. Together we fight this. Do you trust me?" Ben searched her face for a long moment, then nodded. "I trust you." They worked through the night in shifts and together fighting the fever with everything they knew. Cool cloths on Lily's forehead, neck, and wrists, sponge baths to bring her temperature down, water sip by careful sip when she was conscious enough to swallow. Willow bark tea, the natural fever reducer Grace's mother had taught her about years ago. Lily drifted between lucid moments and delirium. Sometimes she knew them, her voice small and frightened. Mama Grace, I don't feel good. Sometimes she talked to people who weren't there, seeing things in the shadows that made her cry out. By 10 o'clock, the fever had climbed to 104 degrees. Grace checked it with her hand against Lily's burning skin, then met Ben's eyes across the bed. We need to cool her more aggressively, Grace said. They stripped Lily down to her undergarments and gave her a cool water bath, both of them supporting the child's small body while sponging water over her skin. Lily shivered despite the fever, teeth chattering, small whimpers escaping her throat. I know, sweetheart, Grace murmured. I know it's awful, but we have to. Ben's face was anguished, watching his daughter suffer, but he stayed focused, following Grace's directions without question. When they finally got Lily back to bed wrapped in a light sheet, the fever had dropped slightly. Not much, but enough to give them hope. At midnight, Grace sent Ben to rest. Just an hour, she insisted when he started to protest. You've been working in brutal heat all day. If you collapse, you're no good to anyone. Ben resisted, but finally went downstairs. Grace heard him moving in the kitchen, forcing himself to eat, to drink, to take care of his body, even as his mind stayed fixed on his daughter. Alone with Lily, Grace fell into a rhythm. Cool the cloth, wring it out, place it gently on burning skin. Check breathing, check pulse, offer water, repeat. The movements became meditative, almost prayer-like. She found herself talking to the unconscious child, her voice low and steady in the quiet room. Lily, honey, you have to fight this. Your papa needs you. He's already lost one person he loved. He can't lose you too. Grace's voice cracked. And I need you. Do you understand, in just these few weeks you've become so important to me. I thought I came here just to work, just to survive. But you made me want to stay, want to be part of something. The admission surprised her with its intensity. When had this child become essential? When had the idea of leaving become unbearable? Please don't go, Grace whispered. Please fight. I'm not ready to lose you. I can't lose you. Tears fell hot down her face, splashing onto the cloth in her hands. She'd lost her parents. She'd lost her hopes when Garrett walked away. She couldn't lose this child. Not this child who'd taken her hand so trustingly, who'd asked her to stay forever, who'd called her Mama Grace with such pure affection. Ben returned exactly 1 hour later, his face haggard but determined. Any change? Grace shook her head, holding steady at about 104. Not climbing but not breaking either. Ben took over the cool cloth duty while Grace stepped back, stretching her aching back. But she didn't leave, couldn't leave, just shifted to the chair by the window where she could watch. Ben talked to his daughter as he worked, his voice rough with emotion. Little bird, I know you're tired. I know you're fighting hard. But I need you to keep fighting. You're a coal. We don't give up. He paused, swallowing hard. Your mama didn't give up. She fought till the very end. You've got her strength in you. I know you do. His voice dropped to barely audible. And Grace is here. She's taking such good care of you. She loves you, little bird. We both do. So you have to stay. You have to. Grace closed her eyes against fresh tears. The rawness in Ben's voice, the naked fear and love stripped away any pretense that this was just an employment arrangement. They'd become a family somehow, the three of them. Fragile and new, but real. The night stretched on with agonizing slowness. 3 o'clock passed, then 4. The fever held at 104, refusing to climb but also refusing to break. Grace and Ben worked in silent partnership, both too exhausted for words, both too terrified to stop. As the first gray light of dawn began to seep through the window, Ben stood abruptly. I'm writing for the doctor. This has gone on too long. Grace was about to agree when Lily's eyes opened. Truly open, focused, and aware, in a way they hadn't been for hours. Papa? The child said, her voice confused and weak. Why are you in my room? It's still dark. Ben's hand shot to her forehead. The change in his expression was like watching the sun break through storm clouds. Grace, he breathed. Grace moved to the bed, her own hand confirming what she saw in Ben's face. The fever had broken. Not gone completely, but broken. Lily's skin was still warm, but no longer burning, no longer that terrifying, dangerous heat. "I'm thirsty," Lily said plaintively. Grace brought water with shaking hands, supporting Lily's head while the child drank. Lily finished the whole cup, then looked around at their faces with growing concern. "Did something bad happen?" she asked. "You both look scared." Ben pulled his daughter into his arms, careful but desperate, his shoulders shaking with silent sobs. "You were very sick, little bird, but you fought through it, just like I knew you would." Lily patted his back with small hands, confused by his emotion, but trying to comfort. "I'm okay, Papa. Don't cry." Grace had to turn away, her own tears falling too fast to hide. The relief was so profound it felt physical, like something solid releasing its grip on her chest. They'd done it. Together they'd kept death from taking this child. Lily fell back asleep within minutes, but this time it was natural sleep, healing sleep. The fever would need monitoring, would likely spike and fall for another day or two, but the crisis had passed. Grace and Ben remained by the bed, neither willing to leave yet, exhausted beyond measure but unable to look away from the child breathing peacefully between them. "Thank you," Ben said finally, his voice wrecked. "If you hadn't been here, if I'd been alone." "We saved her," Grace interrupted gently. "Together." She reached over and took his hand, gripping it firmly. "You didn't freeze Ben. You stayed. You fought beside me every minute. You're not the same man you were when Rebecca died. You're stronger than you know." Ben looked at their joined hands, then up at her face. In the growing morning light, Grace could see every line of exhaustion, every shadow of fear that had marked the night. But she could also see something else, gratitude and recognition, and something deeper that made her breath catch. "I need to tell you something," Ben said, his voice low and rough. "These past weeks having you here, it's changed things. For both Lily and me, we've both gotten attached. More than I meant to let happen." Grace's heart began to hammer. Ben continued, the words seeming to cost him effort, but coming anyway. "I know you came here because you had nowhere else to go. I know this was supposed to be temporary, but somewhere along the way it stopped feeling temporary to me. It started feeling like maybe this could be something real, something permanent." He paused, searching her face. "I don't know what I have to offer you. A hard life on an isolated ranch. A man who's better with horses than conversation. A child who needs more than I know how to give. It's not much compared to what you might find elsewhere." "It's everything," Grace heard herself say, the words coming from someplace deep and honest. "Don't you understand? And this ranch, this child it's everything I thought I'd lost when William Garrett walked away." She gripped his hand tighter. "Purpose, belonging, a place where I matter. Where I'm needed, not because I'm convenient, but because of who I am. That's what you've given me." "Then stay," Ben said, "not as hired help, not as temporary arrangement. Stay as my wife, as Lily's mother, as my partner in this life." The proposal was nothing like what Grace had imagined during those long weeks traveling west to meet a stranger. There was no romance, no pretty speeches, no promises of easy happiness. But there was something better. Truth spoken plainly by a man who'd learned the hard way what mattered and what didn't. "People will talk," Grace said, testing the reality of that. "They already whisper. If we married after only a month, let them talk," Ben said firmly. "I don't care about gossip. I care about building a life that works. That's honest. That's based on something real." His gray eyes held hers steadily. "You've proven yourself 100 times over. You've worked harder than anyone I've ever known. You've cared for my daughter like she was your own. You didn't run when things got hard. You stayed and you fought. That's all the proof I need," he said simply. Grace looked at Lily, sleeping peacefully now, her small face relaxed and free of pain. She thought about the garden thriving under her care, about the house slowly transforming into a home, about the quiet satisfaction of work that mattered. She thought about Ben's steady presence, his rough kindness, the way he'd looked at her during the long night, like she was essential, like her being there made all the difference. "It won't be easy," she said quietly, "building a marriage out of necessity and circumstance." "Nothing worthwhile ever is," Ben replied. "But I think we've got something most couples don't start with. We've already seen each other at our worst. We've already worked through crisis together. We know what we're getting." He was right. There would be no ugly surprises, no discovering too late that they couldn't weather hardship together. They'd already been tested. Yes, Grace said, the word coming out steady and sure. Yes, I'll stay. I'll marry you. Ben's eyes closed briefly, a relief washing over his features. When he opened them again, there was warmth there Grace hadn't seen before. Not the heat of passion, but something deeper and more durable. He leaned forward slowly, giving her time to pull away, and pressed his lips to hers in a kiss that was chaste and solemn, sealing the promise they'd just made. When they pulled apart, Lily was watching them with sleepy satisfaction. I knew it. She mumbled, a smile tugging at her lips, despite her exhaustion. I told Papa you should stay forever. You should be sleeping, Grace said, but she couldn't keep the joy from her voice. I am sleeping, Lily insisted, her eyes already drifting closed again. This is a dream, a really good dream. Ben laughed, a sound Grace had heard so rarely it startled her. He pulled Grace close, wrapping his arm around her shoulders, and together they sat watching Lily sleep as the sun climbed higher and the ranch came to life around them. The heat would return with the day, fierce and unforgiving. There would be work to do, challenges to face, gossip to endure. But for this moment, in the aftermath of crisis, in the beginning of something new, Grace let herself simply be present. Grateful for the child breathing peacefully, for the man beside her, for the unexpected grace of second chances. She had come west expecting one life and found something entirely different. Not easier, not simpler, but infinitely more real. And as morning light filled the small bedroom, Grace Winters, soon to be Grace, Cole felt something she hadn't felt since her parents died. The solid certainty of being exactly where she belonged. The week between the proposal and the wedding passed in a blur of activity and quiet preparation. Lily recovered quickly with the remarkable resilience of childhood, though Ben and Grace both watched her carefully, neither quite able to forget how close they'd come to losing her. Ben rode into town on Monday, enduring the knowing looks and congratulations as he spoke with the Reverend Powell and posted the banns. Henry Morrison clasped his hand warmly at the general store. About time, Ben Henry said with genuine pleasure. Anyone with eyes could see it coming. Was it that obvious? Ben asked, somewhat bemused. To everyone but you two, apparently. Henry replied, Catherine will be pleased. She's been hoping you'd find someone since Rebecca passed. Ben also ordered a few supplies, including a spool of white ribbon Grace had mentioned wanting for Lily's hair. The gesture touched Grace more deeply than expensive gifts might have. It showed he'd been listening, had remembered small details in the midst of everything else. Grace found the trunk in Ben's room as she was cleaning upstairs, the one she'd glimpsed briefly but never examined. Inside was the cream fabric with small blue flowers that Rebecca had bought for some special occasion. Wedding dress material, never used, plans interrupted by illness and death. Grace held the fabric carefully, feeling the weight of another woman's dreams in her hands. Lily found her there, sitting on the edge of Ben's bed with the material spread across her lap. That was Mama's, Lily said softly. She bought it to make something pretty, but she got sick before she could. Grace looked up at the child. Do you mind if I use it for my wedding dress? Lily climbed onto the bed beside her, small fingers touching the fabric. Mama would want you to. She didn't like things going to waste, and she'd want Papa to be happy again. The simple wisdom in the child's words made Grace's throat tight. Tell me about your mama, she said. What was she like? She sang all the time. Lily said, her face taking on the distant expression of someone reaching for memories just out of grasp. Made up songs about chickens and rain. She let me help make bread even when I made a mess. She tucked me in every night with 3 kisses. Forehead, each cheek. Lily paused, then added with childish honesty, she told Papa she loved him every morning, even when they were mad at each other. Grace absorbed this, not threatened by the memory, but honoring it. She sounds wonderful. She was, Lily agreed, but she's gone. And you're here, and I think it's okay to love you both. Oh, sweetheart, Grace pulled the child close. That's more than okay. That's exactly right. That evening, Grace began cutting the fabric by lamplight after Lily had gone to bed. Ben appeared in the doorway, watching silently as she worked. Rebecca would have approved, he said finally. She wasn't one for waste. She'd be glad to see it used for something good. Grace looked up from her work. Tell me about her. Not if it's too painful, but I'd like to know. Ben lowered himself into the chair across from her, his large frame making the furniture seem fragile. He was quiet for so long Grace thought he might refuse, but then he began to speak. She was strong. That's what I remember most. Came west alone, survived her intended dying, married a stranger because it made practical sense. She could have been bitter about it, spent our marriage mourning what she'd lost. But she chose to build something instead. He paused, his hands flexing. We didn't have a love match at first. That came later, grew slow over years of working side by side. But we had respect from the beginning and trust. And that turned out to be enough foundation for everything else. The parallel wasn't lost on Grace. He was telling her their story while ostensibly telling Rebecca's, letting her know what he believed about marriage, about how love could be built rather than simply found. She sounds remarkable, Grace said. She was? Ben agreed. And so are you in different ways. He leaned forward, his expression earnest. I'm not trying to replace her with you, Grace. I'm trying to build something new. I want you to know that. I do know it, Grace said. She set down her scissors to give him her full attention. I'm not trying to be her shadow. I'm trying to be myself. Make my own place here. You already have, Ben said simply. The house feels lived in again. Lily laughs. I come in from the fields and there's good food and someone who makes it feel like coming home instead of just coming back to work. After he'd gone upstairs, Grace sat for a long moment with the half-cut fabric in her lap. This was what they were building. Not passion or romance, but something steadier and deeper. A partnership, a home, a future constructed from honest work and mutual need, and the choice to show up for each other day after day. She could live with that, more than live with it. She could thrive in it. By Friday evening, the dress was complete, simple but well made, the cream fabric with its small blue flowers fitting Grace's figure modestly. She stood in her small room looking at her reflection, hardly recognizing the woman in the mirror. Not the desperate, humiliated girl who'd arrived a month ago. Someone stronger looking back. Lily burst in without knocking, her eyes going wide. You look like a princess, she breathed. Just Grace, Grace corrected gently. Just a woman getting married. Still beautiful, Lily insisted. The wedding was set for Saturday afternoon on the ranch porch. Small and simple, just as Grace wanted. Just as felt right. That night, the last night before everything changed officially, Grace and Ben found themselves on the porch together. It had become their habit, these quiet evening conversations after Lily slept. You nervous, Ben asked. Terrified, Grace admitted. About marrying me, about whether I'll be enough, Grace said honestly. Whether I can really do this. Be a wife and mother, build a life here. Ben turned to face her, fully taking her hand. Grace, you've already been doing it. For weeks now. Tomorrow just makes it official. He paused, seeming to gather his thoughts. I need you to understand something. I'm not a man of pretty words or grand gestures. I'm going to disappoint you sometimes. Frustrate you often. This life is hard, isolated. The work never ends. But I will show up, he continued firmly. Every single day, I'll work beside you. I'll be honest with you even when it's hard. I'll provide for you even when money's tight. And I'll stand by you through whatever comes. He met her eyes directly. That's what I can promise. Is it enough? Grace looked at this man, weathered and sincere, offering truth instead of poetry. It's more than enough. It's everything that matters. Saturday afternoon arrived clear and hot. Grace dressed carefully in the cream fabric that had once been Rebecca's dreams, now transformed into her own beginning. Lily helped with the buttons, chattering excitedly about the wedding. The small gathering assembled on the porch. Reverend Powell to officiate, Henry and Catherine Morrison, Peter and Ann Johnson from a neighboring ranch, Dr. Harrison, who'd heard about Lily's illness and come to check on her, staying for the wedding at Ben's invitation. It was intimate and honest, exactly what this marriage was. Reverend Powell spoke briefly about partnership, about commitment through hardship, about building something larger than individual need. He spoke of marriage as daily choice, not just single moment. His words felt true in a way elaborate ceremony never could. When the time came for vows, Ben spoke his promise clearly, his eyes never leaving Grace's face. I, Benjamin Cole, take you, Grace Winters, to be my lawful wedded wife. I promise to provide for you, to protect you, and to stand by you through whatever comes. I promise to honor you, to work beside you, and to build a home with you. I promise to be a true husband to you from this day forward. Grace's turn came, her voice steady despite her racing heart. I, Grace Winters, take you Benjamin Cole to be my lawful wedded husband. I promise to work beside you, to care for your home and your daughter, and to stand by you through whatever comes. I promise to honor you, to be faithful to you, and to build a life with you. I promise to be a true wife to you from this day forward. Simple vows stripped of flowery language, focused on the practical realities of the life they were choosing. By the power vested in me by the territory of Montana, Reverend Powell said, I now pronounce you husband and wife. Ben, you may kiss your bride. Ben leaned down and kissed Grace gently, brief tender, sealing their promise. Lily cheered from where she stood beside them, and the small gathering applauded warmly. Grace Winters was now Grace Cole. They shared Catherine's wedding cake and lemonade on the porch, the afternoon sun making everything glow golden. Catherine pulled Grace aside while the men talked. You've chosen well, she said warmly. Ben's a good man, solid. He'll weather any storm, and that child needed you desperately. Thank you, Grace said, meaning it. For everything. Not everyone in town will approve, Catherine added more seriously. Some will say it's too fast, too improper. Eleanor Patterson will have plenty to say. Let her talk, Grace replied, surprised by her own confidence. Catherine smiled. Good, that's the spirit you'll need. Strong spine and clear conscience. That's all any of us can manage. As the sun lowered toward the mountains, the guests began to depart. Lily, exhausted from excitement, went down for a nap on the sofa. Ben and Grace found themselves alone, officially married now, but uncertain of what came next. The evening should have been peaceful, a chance to settle into their new reality. Instead, the sound of hoofbeats approaching fast shattered the quiet. Ben's posture went immediately alert. Stay inside, he said, moving toward the porch. But Grace followed, unwilling to hide. A rider was approaching at dangerous speed, the horse lathered and wild-eyed. As he drew closer, Grace's stomach dropped. William Garrett, drunk and furious. He reined in hard, nearly unseating himself. The man who'd rejected her so publicly a month ago now sat swaying in his saddle, his face flushed with alcohol and rage. Heard you got married today, Garrett slurred, his eyes fixing on Grace with something ugly. Congratulations. Congratulations on stealing the life that should have been mine. Ben stepped between them, immediately his voice dropping to that dangerous quiet Grace had learned to recognize. Garrett, you're drunk. Get on your horse and leave, now. Garrett ignored him, continuing to stare at Grace. You played me, didn't you? Made yourself look better in that photograph. Manipulated the whole situation. The accusation was so absurd, so divorced from reality, that Grace almost laughed. But there was nothing funny about Garrett's expression, about the violence simmering beneath his drunken words. Mr. Garrett, Grace said calmly, stepping around Ben, despite his protective stance. I did no such thing. The photograph was accurate. You judged me by my appearance and found me lacking. That was your right, but it doesn't give you any claim on my life now. My right, Garrett's voice rose. You were supposed to be my wife. I sent for you. I paid your passage. That ranch, that child, that life, it should all be mine. You had your chance, Ben said, his voice like steel. You threw it away based on shallow judgment. That's not her failing. That's yours. Garrett's rage seemed to collapse, suddenly folding in on itself. He slumped in his saddle, no longer threatening but pathetic. Do you know what it's like, he asked, voice breaking, watching everyone else get what you wanted, being alone? Despite everything, Grace felt a flicker of something that wasn't quite pity but wasn't entirely unsympathetic either. Mr. Garrett, she said more gently, I do know what that's like. I stood on that platform while you walked away. I stood there with nothing. So yes, I understand being alone. She paused, choosing her words carefully. But here's what I learned. Being alone is sometimes a gift. It means you haven't settled. It means you're waiting for the right thing instead of forcing the wrong thing. You and I would have made each other miserable, she continued. You wanted someone who fit your idea of attractive. I wanted someone who saw past the surface. We both got lucky that day, even if you don't see it yet. Ben added his own words, stepping beside Grace in united front. You can leave here with dignity, Garrett. Sober up, build your own life, find someone who actually suits you. Or you can make this ugly, try to hurt people who've done nothing wrong. And I promise you that path won't end well. Garrett seemed to struggle with himself, alcohol and anger fighting with some remnant of reason. Finally, he dismounted clumsily, nearly falling. I've made such a mess of everything, he said to no one in particular. He looked up at Grace with something like genuine regret. You're right, we would have been miserable. I would have made you miserable. To Ben, he added, she's lucky to have you. You actually see her. I never saw anyone, just what I wanted them to be. Ben helped Garrett back onto his horse with more mercy than the man deserved. Peter Johnson's ranch is 2 miles east. Tell him you need to sleep it off. He'll help. Garrett nodded, suddenly docile. Before leaving, he looked at Grace one last time. I'm sorry for what I did to you on that platform. You deserve better. I got better, Grace said simply. I hope you find it too. They watched him ride off into the gathering dusk, his figure wavering and uncertain. Do you think he meant it? Grace asked. The apology. In this moment, Ben replied, whether it lasts past sobriety, who knows? But it doesn't matter. He's not part of our life. He can't touch what we've built. Grace turned to face her husband fully. Can we go inside now? It's our wedding night, and I'd like to spend it with my husband, not thinking about the past. Ben smiled, rare and genuine. Yes, ma'am. They went inside together, leaving the day's drama behind, ready to begin the life they'd chosen. Not perfect, not easy, but theirs. Built on honesty and work and the determined choice to show up for each other. Grace Winters, Wooden had found her home. Not in a place, but in the building of something real with someone who saw her worth. And that she thought as Ben took her hand and led her upstairs was more than enough. It was everything. The first weeks of marriage brought adjustments Grace hadn't anticipated. Not difficulties, exactly, but the subtle recalibration required when temporary arrangements became permanent bonds. She moved her few belongings from the small storage room to the larger bedroom Ben had occupied alone for 2 years. The space still bore traces of Rebecca. A hairbrush on the dresser, a shawl hanging on a peg. But Ben had clearly made an effort to create room for Grace, clearing drawers and moving aside his own things with careful consideration. This is your room now, too, he said simply, watching her unpack. Your home. The words settled into Grace with unexpected weight. She'd spent so long feeling displaced, temporary, unwanted. But standing here in this room with her new husband, knowing Lily slept peacefully down the hall, Grace felt the first stirrings of genuine belonging. The rhythm of their days adjusted to accommodate new intimacies. They woke together now, Grace braiding her hair while Ben dressed. Coffee on the porch before work began became their quiet ritual, a few minutes of companionable silence before the demands of the day descended. At night, they lay side by side in the darkness, learning the shape of each other's breathing, the small sounds and movements that marked the boundary between waking and sleep. Physical intimacy developed gradually, respectfully, with a tenderness Grace hadn't expected. Ben was patient and careful, aware that this was new territory for her, taking time to build comfort alongside desire. What they created together wasn't the passionate romance of storybooks, but something that felt more durable. Partnership extending into all aspects of life. Lily adjusted to the change with the flexibility of childhood. One evening, about a week after the wedding, she appeared at dinner with a question that had clearly been building. Mama Grace, she started, then paused. Do I have to say the Grace part? Can I just say Mama? Grace felt her throat tighten. What feels right to you, honey? Mama Lily decided firmly. Because that's who you are now, then just Mama. It is. Grace managed, blinking back sudden tears. Ben reached across the table and squeezed Grace's hand, his eyes telling her he understood the significance of this moment. His daughter had just chosen Grace completely, without reservation or qualification. August faded into September, and the relentless summer heat finally began to break. Mornings came with a hint of coolness that made work easier. The garden Grace had rescued in June now produced abundantly, rewarding her patient care with tomatoes heavy on the vine, beans climbing their poles with determination, squash spreading across carefully tended rows. Grace threw herself into preserving the harvest. Her mother had taught her years ago, and the skills came back with muscle memory. Tomatoes packed into jars with salt and herbs, cucumbers transformed into pickles, their brine sharp and satisfying, beans dried on racks in the sun. Each jar she sealed was a promise against winter, tangible proof that her work mattered. She began selling surplus through Morrison's general store. Eggs from the chickens, preserves, baked goods made with butter she'd learned to churn herself. The first time Henry Morrison pressed coins into her palm for a dozen jars of pickles and 2 loaves of bread, Grace stared at the money with something like wonder. I've never earned my own money before, she admitted. You earned it fair and square, Henry said warmly. And it's good product. Folks are already asking when you'll have more. Grace used her first earnings to buy fabric for Lily's winter dresses, new hair ribbons, and supplies for making their own candles. Pride swelled in her chest, not just at having money, but at contributing financially to the household. She wasn't just keeping house. She was building an enterprise, however small. The town's acceptance of her grew gradually. At church on Sundays, women began including Grace in their conversations. They asked for her preserving recipes, complimented the neat dresses Lily wore, invited the Cole family to harvest celebrations. Grace was no longer that mail-order bride who was rejected, no longer the woman living improperly with a widower. She was Mrs. Cole, Ben's wife, Lily's mother, a member of the community in her own right. Eleanor Patterson remained coldly polite, but Grace found she simply didn't care anymore. Eleanor's opinion held no power over her life over the certainty Grace had built through work and commitment. One Sunday after service, Catherine Morrison pulled Grace aside. "You've done well," she said with genuine warmth. "Not everyone could have turned that situation around like you did. You should be proud." "I am," Grace replied, surprised by how true it was. For the first time in years, perhaps ever, she was genuinely proud of herself. As September turned toward October, Ben began preparing for winter with the methodical thoroughness of someone who'd learned the hard way not to take Montana's mercy for granted. He showed Grace everything she needed to know: how to stack firewood properly with bark up for air circulation, how to check the chimney for blockages that could mean disaster when the real cold came, how to winterize the chicken coop so the birds would survive temperatures that could drop to dangerous lows. "Winter here isn't like back east," he explained, as they worked together caulking cracks in the barn walls. "Once snow comes, we might not get to town for weeks. Everything we need to have on hand." Grace absorbed the lessons carefully, understanding that frontier survival meant preparation and self-sufficiency. Peter Johnson stopped by one October afternoon with an offer to include them in the winter supply run to Helena before the mountain passes closed. "We're heading out next week," Peter said, "getting flour, sugar, coffee, lamp oil, medicines. Anything you folks need, make a list. We look out for each other out here." Ben and Grace made their list together that evening, calculating what they'd need to last through months of potential isolation. The collaboration felt natural now, two minds working toward shared goals. Ben valued Grace's input, asked her opinion, adjusted plans based on her suggestions. They were truly partners. The cold front arrived at the third week of November with shocking suddenness. Grace woke one morning to find the temperature had dropped 40 degrees overnight. Frost coated everything, transforming the ranch into a crystalline landscape that would have been beautiful if it hadn't been so ominous. Ben came in from his early barn check with worry evident on his weathered face. "This isn't normal," he said, warming his hands around his coffee cup. "Too cold, too early. If this holds, we could lose cattle." "How cold?" Grace asked. "Cold enough to kill livestock if they're not sheltered proper. Cold enough to freeze water in the well if we're not careful." They spent the day in frantic preparation. Ben moved cattle to the south pasture where natural windbreaks offered better protection. Grace hauled water to fill every container they owned, insurance against the well freezing. Lily helped where she could, carrying firewood and feeding chickens, with the seriousness of a child who understood this was important. By evening, the temperature had dropped further. Wind howled around the house, finding every crack and gap despite their caulking efforts. Ben stood at the window, staring out at the barn, calculation and worry warring in his expression. "I need to check the cattle before full dark," he said. "Make sure they're not freezing in the pasture." "I'll come with you," Grace offered immediately. "No," Ben said firmly. "Too dangerous. Lily needs you here." He was right, but Grace hated it. Hated watching him bundle up in layers. Hated the casual way he kissed her goodbye, as if this were routine. Hated how the wind stole him from sight within moments of leaving the porch. An hour passed. Ben didn't return. Grace kept herself busy keeping the fire high, checking on Lily, trying not to watch the clock. But as the second hour approached with no sign of her husband, fear began to claw at her chest. "Where's Papa?" Lily asked, pressing close to Grace's side. "Checking the animal, sweetheart. He'll be back soon." But Grace's voice lacked conviction. Something was wrong. She could feel it. When the third hour passed, with still no Ben, Grace faced an impossible choice: stay with Lily in safety and warmth, or go search for Ben in dangerous cold, leaving their daughter alone. There was no good option, only the terrible calculus of risk. Grace knelt before Lily, taking the child's small face in her hands. "Sweetie, I need you to be very brave. I need to find Papa." "Don't leave me," Lily cried, fear naked in her voice. "Listen to me," Grace said firmly. "You stay inside. Keep the fire going exactly how I showed you. Don't open the door for anyone but me or Papa." "Do you understand?" Lily was crying, but nodded. Grace wrapped herself in Ben's coat so large it swallowed her frame but warmer than her own. She took the rifle, though she prayed she wouldn't need it. Wolves sometimes came close and cold like this, desperate and dangerous. Outside, the cold was vicious. Wind like knives cutting through layers. Snow had started small, hard pellets that stung exposed skin. Grace could barely see 10 feet ahead, the world reduced to swirling white and gathering darkness. She followed the fence line toward the south pasture, the direction Ben had gone, calling his name into the wind that stole her voice. "Ben, Ben." A quarter mile from the house, she saw a dark shape in the snow. Her heart stopped. Ben lay collapsed near the fence, motionless. Grace ran, fell, got up, ran again. She reached him and dropped to her knees, hands already searching for signs of life. Breathing, yes, shallow but present. Pulse, yes, weak but there. Head wound, blood, frozen in his hair where he must have struck the fence post when he fell. Right leg at a wrong angle, broken or badly twisted. Hypothermia was setting in. His skin was cold, lips tinged blue. Grace had to get him back to the house. But he was too heavy to carry, and she couldn't leave him to freeze while she went for help. She forced herself to think past panic. The work sled? She'd seen it near the barn that morning. Making a decision, Grace ran back toward the ranch, checked on Lily through the window, the child's terrified face pressed to the glass, hitched a horse to the sled with hands so numb she could barely feel the leather, drove back out into the killing cold. Getting Ben onto the sled was brutal work. She had to use leverage, not strength, rolling his dead weight rather than lifting. Every moment felt like an hour. Every second he stayed in the cold was a second closer to death. But finally, impossibly, she got him loaded. Led the horse back with agonizing slowness, fighting wind and snow and her own exhaustion. At the house, Lily helped, tiny hands pulling while Grace dragged. Together, they got him inside onto the bed. Grace stripped his frozen clothes with shaking hands, checked his injuries with growing dread. The head wound needed stitching, the leg needed to be set. His core temperature was dangerously low, and there was no doctor, no help, no one but Grace and a terrified 7-year-old. Rebecca's medical book was on a shelf in the kitchen. Grace had seen it weeks ago, hadn't thought much about it. Now she grabbed it, desperately flipping through pages about wound care and broken bones and hypothermia treatment. She boiled water, found needle and thread, cleaned the head wound with hands steadier than they had any right to be, stitched the gash closed with small, careful stitches while Lily held the lamp. The leg was worse. Grace examined it carefully, feeling the wrongness in the bone alignment. It had to be set properly or Ben might never walk right again. The book showed diagrams, explained technique, but reading about it and doing it were vastly different things. "I'm sorry," Grace whispered to unconscious Ben. "This is going to hurt." She aligned the bone, pulled, felt the terrible crunch of its setting. Ben regained consciousness for one agonized moment, screaming, then passed out again. Grace splinted the leg with boards from the kindling box, binding it as tightly as she dared. For hypothermia, the book said gradual warming. Hot water bottles wrapped in cloth placed around the body. Blankets, body heat. Grace and Lily lay on either side of Ben through the night, sharing their warmth while the storm raged outside. Grace changed the hot water bottles every hour, checked his breathing obsessively, and prayed harder than she'd prayed since her parents died. By dawn, fever had set in. Infection risk from the head wound. Grace fought it the way she'd fought Lily's fever, with cool cloths and willow bark tea and relentless attention. Ben was delirious, talking to people who weren't there. Sometimes he called for Rebecca, reliving her death. "I should have saved you. I'm sorry." Sometimes he didn't recognize Grace at all, but Grace didn't falter. She'd saved Lily. She would save Ben. Failure wasn't an option. 3 days later, the fever broke. Ben opened his eyes, truly conscious, and saw Grace sitting beside the bed. "You found me," he said, his voice rough from disuse. "Of course I found you," Grace replied, tears starting despite her exhaustion. Ben's hand found hers. My leg, broken. I said it. Dr. Harrison can check when we can reach town, but I did my best. You set my leg. By yourself, what choice did I have? Grace tried to smile, but it came out watery. You've saved me. I figured it was my turn. Over the following weeks, Ben's recovery was slow and frustrating. His leg in a splint for 6 weeks meant he couldn't do the heavy ranch work that defined his identity. He struggled with feeling useless, dependent, diminished. But the forced rest also gave him time to watch Grace take over responsibilities he'd always assumed were his alone. She hauled hay to cattle. She chopped wood with improving technique. She broke ice on water troughs twice daily in brutal cold. Peter Johnson helped with the heaviest tasks, but Grace managed most of it herself. Ben watched from the window, his expression complicated. Never thought I'd be the one inside looking out, he admitted one afternoon. You'd do the same if positions were reversed, Grace said simply. You're stronger than I gave you credit for. Grace met his eyes steadily. I'm stronger than I gave myself credit for. Christmas came quietly. Deep snow made town unreachable, but Grace made the day special anyway. Cookies baked with Lily. Simple gifts she'd made by lamplight. A Christmas dinner using preserved vegetables and salt pork transformed into something almost festive. Ben's gift to Grace was a carved wooden box he'd made before his injury. Inside, he'd placed the torn photograph pieces from the platform. So you never forget how far you've come, he said. Our starting point, Grace agreed, touching the pieces gently. Our redemption, Ben added. By March, Ben's leg had healed. Dr. Harrison, finally able to reach them after the worst of winter passed, examined Ben's leg with professional interest. Mrs. Cole, he said to Grace, you set this perfectly. Better than I could have done. Truly remarkable work. I had good reason to do it right, Grace replied, looking at her husband. Spring arrived like a promise kept. The snow melted, revealing brown grass that would soon turn green. Calves were born. The garden could be planted again. Life renewed itself with the changing season. One morning in early May, Grace stood at the garden plot planning the year's planting. Ben joined her, his limp barely noticeable now, and slipped his arm around her waist. We should expand this year, he said. Maybe add another row for potatoes. You're better at this than anyone I've known. Grace leaned into him, comfortable with his presence in a way that had grown naturally over the winter months. We're good partners, the best Ben agreed. They were interrupted by the sound of a rider approaching. Grace tensed instinctively, but Ben's hand on her back was steady. The rider resolved into William Garrett, but this was a different man from the drunk who'd crashed their wedding. Sober, humble, clearly sober for some time. Mr. Cole, Mrs. Cole Garrett said, dismounting and standing at a respectful distance. I've come to apologize. Properly this time. Grace and Ben exchanged a glance, then faced Garrett together. He looked uncomfortable but determined, like a man who'd rehearsed this speech many times. I won't take much of your time, Garrett continued. I know I'm not welcome here, but I owe you both an apology, a real one. He looked at Grace directly. Mrs. Cole, what I did to you on that platform was unforgivable. I judged you by your appearance and found you wanting. But I was the one lacking. I was shallow, cruel, and cowardly. You deserve better. Garrett paused, swallowing hard. I've spent these months watching my life fall apart. My business failed. My reputation is in ruins. I lost everything I thought mattered. And I deserve to lose it, he said with painful honesty, because I never built anything real. I just accumulated things and thought that was enough. He looked at both of them now. You two built something real, a family, a partnership, something that lasts through hardship. I'm not here to ask forgiveness, just to take responsibility and to say thank you. Grace frowned. Thank us for showing me what I could have had if I'd been a better man, Garrett said simply. You gave me a mirror to see my own failures. I'm leaving Montana, going back east to start over. But before I left, I needed to say this. You were never the problem, Mrs. Cole. I was, and I'm deeply sorry. Grace stepped forward, surprising both men. Mr. Garrett, I accept your apology, but I want to be clear. I forgive you, but forgiveness doesn't mean we're friends. It doesn't mean you're part of our lives. She spoke firmly, but without cruelty. You did me a favor that day, even if you didn't intend it. You freed me to find what I actually needed. A man who sees past surface. A man who keeps his what's in. A man who builds with me instead of evaluating me. Grace turned to Ben. You gave me nothing, Mr. Garrett, and I'm grateful for that nothing because it led me to everything. Garrett nodded slowly, accepting her words with grace. That's more than I deserve. Thank you, Mrs. Cole. To Ben, he said, you're a lucky man. Every single day, Ben replied, his arm tightening around Grace. Garrett mounted his horse, preparing to leave. For what it's worth, I think you two will last. You've got something real. Hold on to it. He rode away, and this time there was closure rather than drama. Grace watched him go with something like peace settling in her chest. How do you feel, Ben asked. Glad he came. Glad he apologized. Glad he's leaving Grace listed. And grateful because he was right. What we have is real. June arrived warm and golden. A year had passed since Grace stepped off the train in Copper Ridge, since William Garrett tore her photograph, and walked away since Ben offered her shelter and changed everything. Grace, Ben, and Lily went to town for supplies on a Saturday morning. Standing on the same platform where her nightmare had begun, Grace looked around with new eyes. Mama, you're smiling, Lily observed. What are you thinking about? About how grateful I am, Grace said, taking her daughter's hand. For hard things that lead to good things. For second chances. For family. Ben pulled her close, his hand warm on her waist. No regrets, Grace looked at him, at Lily, at the life they'd built together. Not a single one. The train pulled in, and Grace watched passengers disembark. A young woman stepped down, nervous and hopeful, carrying a carpet bag. She scanned the crowd with growing anxiety, clearly looking for someone who wasn't there. Grace recognized herself in that face. The hope, the fear, the terrible vulnerability. Excuse me, Grace said, approaching the young woman. Are you all right? Can I help you? The woman's eyes filled with tears. I was supposed to meet someone, but I don't see anyone. What's your name, Sarah? Sarah Mitchell, Sarah, Grace said warmly. I'm Grace Cole. This is my husband, Ben, and our daughter, Lily. If you need help, a place to stay, someone to talk to, we're here. You don't even know me, Sarah whispered. I don't need to, Grace replied. I've stood where you're standing. I know what it feels like. And I know that sometimes the worst moments open doors to the best things. Ben loaded Sarah's bag into their wagon without being asked. Lily chattered to her about the ranch, about the chickens, about how Grace made the best biscuits. Riding home, Grace felt the rightness of it. She'd received help when she needed it most. Now she could offer that same help to someone else. The circle completing itself. That evening, after Sarah had been settled in the small storage room that had once been Grace's, after Lily had gone to bed, and the ranch had quieted, Grace and Ben stood on the porch together. Their place, their ritual, their moment of peace at day's end. Montana stretched out before them, vet and beautiful in the fading light. Grace thought about the journey that had brought her here. The rejection, the fear, the slow building of something real and lasting. Thank you, she said to Ben, for seeing me when I felt invisible, for giving me a place to belong, for building this life with me. Thank you for staying, Ben replied, for fighting for us, for making this house a home again. He kissed her tender and sure, and Grace felt the solid certainty of being exactly where she belonged. The train whistle echoed across the evening just as it had 1 year ago. But this time, Grace didn't look back. She was already home, Montana. June 1944. Grace Cole sat on the porch of the ranch house, 85 years old now, her hands folded in her lap. The mountains looked the same as they had 61 years ago, eternal and unchanging. But everything else had transformed. Her grandson James sat beside her, 18 years old, and leaving for war in the morning. His duffel bag was packed in the house, his uniform pressed and waiting. But tonight he'd asked his grandmother to tell him a story. Grandma, he'd said, were you scared when you came west, leaving everything behind? And Grace had smiled and began the story, about the platform and the torn photograph, about Ben's unexpected kindness, about Lily's fever and the long winter, about building a life from broken pieces. James had listened in silence, absorbing every word. Now, as the story ended, he sat quietly processing. So Grandpa Ben wasn't your first choice, he asked finally. No, Grace said, but he was my best choice. My only real choice, as it turned out. And you never regretted it, never wondered what life would have been like with Garrett, Grace laughed softly. Not for 1 second. William Garrett would have made me miserable. Your grandfather made me happy. She paused, looking at the mountains. Not every day. We had hard times. That winter I told you about was just the first of many. We struggled with money. We lost cattle. We grieved together when we lost our second baby before it could be born. Life was hard, but we showed up for each other, Grace continued. Every single day. That's what marriage is, James, not romance, commitment. James shifted restlessly. Grandma, I'm scared I won't measure up. In the war, as a man. What if I fail? Grace took his hand, her grip still strong despite her age. James' failure isn't falling down. Failure is refusing to get back up. She leaned forward, making sure he heard every word. I stood on that platform with nothing. I'd been rejected publicly. I had no money, no prospects, no future I could see. I could have given up. Gone back east, lived in my aunt's attic, accepted that I wasn't good enough. But I got up, Grace said firmly. I accepted help. I worked hard. I built something from nothing. James, you're going to war. You'll face things I can't imagine. You might fall down. Grace's voice was steady, certain. But Coles get back up. We fight. We endure. We show up even when it's hard. She held his face gently. You're Ben Cole's grandson. You have his strength, and you have mine. You'll measure up because you already have what matters. The courage to keep going. How do you know when you're on the right path, James asked. You don't. Not always, Grace admitted. Sometimes you just have to trust that hard things lead to good things. That rejection can be redirection. That the door that closes might be pushing you towards something better. The day William Garrett walked away, I thought my life was over, Grace said quietly. But it wasn't. It was beginning. Sometimes God's greatest gifts come wrapped in rejection. She squeezed James's hand. You go to war. You fight for what's right. You come home safe. And when you do, you build something real. Something that lasts with someone who sees your worth. That's all any of us can do, Grace said. Show up, work hard, love well, and trust that's enough. James hugged her fiercely. I'll make you proud, Grandma. You already have, Grace whispered. They sat together as the sun set over Montana. The porch where Grace had told this story was the same porch where she'd first arrived as a desperate stranger, where she and Ben had courted in quiet evening conversations, where they'd been married, where they'd built 60 years of life together. Ben had been gone for 5 years now. Grace still felt his absence like a physical ache, but she also felt his presence in everything around her, the house they'd built, the ranch they'd tended, the children and grandchildren they'd raised, the legacy they'd created together. James left the next morning in his uniform, standing tall and trying to be brave. Grace blessed him and watched him go, praying he'd come home safe. Alone on the porch again, Grace closed her eyes and let memory wash over her. She saw herself at 24 standing on that platform with torn photograph at her feet. She saw Ben's gray eyes assessing her with unexpected kindness. She saw Lily's small hand slipping into hers. She saw all the moments that had built a life, the hard moments, the joyful moments, the ordinary moments that had accumulated into something extraordinary. Grace Winters had come to Montana with nothing but broken dreams. She'd built a life with her own hands beside a man who saw her, worth raising children who became hers in every way that mattered. She'd learned that home wasn't a place you traveled to, but something you built one choice at a time with people brave enough to stay. And she'd learned that sometimes being left behind was the greatest gift you'd ever receive. The train whistle blew in the distance just as it had 61 years ago. But Grace didn't turn to look. She was already home. She'd always been home. Not in a place, but in the life she'd chosen. In the man she'd married. In the family she'd built. In the decision made new each day to show up and work hard and love well. That Grace thought as the sun warmed her face was the secret. Not to avoid falling, not to never fail, but to get back up, to keep going, to build something real from whatever materials life provided. She'd come west as a rejected mail-order bride. She'd become Grace Cole, wife, mother, grandmother, builder of a life that lasted. And in the end, that was more than enough. It was everything. The Montana wind whispered through the grass, carrying the scent of sage and earth and home. Grace Cole closed her eyes, content, complete, and grateful for the torn photograph that had set her free.